I'm just going to pick up on some of the themes that have been covered by the talks that have come before me, and really focus on this question of whether this is a lost opportunity or a new dawn. And I guess the starting point for that is where are we at the moment? Have we already lost an opportunity? And one reference point is the House Commons Public Administration Select Committee report in July 2013, which was very critical of procurement in the UK. But it wasn't talking about Welsh Government procurement, of course, and that's quite different. But you're talking about the UK, referring to the fact that there's about £227 billion a year spent on UK public procurement. Of that, about 40 billion is in Westminster. And then these are the sort of conclusions that the report drew. So clearly the first one, not enough done to improve access of SMEs. It's a value judgment. I mean, it assumes that the right thing to do is to do a lot, but nevertheless it's based on comparing job creation numbers by SMEs, which is high, and access to contracts by SMEs, which is low. And the government now has a target of 25% of public spend should be on SMEs directly or indirectly. And it's fair to say that recent figures indicate that particularly indirect spend, supply chain spend on SMEs is growing as a result of that initiative. And arguably, that's the way that the SMEs prefer it, because they then don't have prime contractor responsibility. But critical of the government in this respect. Secondly, and this is very much evidence-based, that the government has failed to set out a clear strategy for public procurement. And the evidence that was repeatedly given to the Public Administration Select Committee was that government was not, the public sector and particularly government was not managing contracts properly, was not resourcing the procurement function properly. There's a skills gap, there's a leadership gap, there was inconsistency. Now, of course, the public sector is much broader than just government, but this is about leadership, and the House Commons was looking to the government for leadership and was concluding that leadership had not been provided. And then the third quote, I mean, this is very much an anecdotal quote, and if you look at the report, there's not a lot of evidence in the report to substantiate this. And as Abby said, the statistics indicate that the British companies do very well in bidding for European contracts, second only to Germany across the EU, which is not bad given our sort of language deficiencies when you think about it. And in relation to UK contracts by value, it's only about 3% that go to non-UK based companies, and that's sort of favourably below the European average. So this sort of is maybe to be questioned. But these are the lines, really. These are the lines of battle. The minister's predilection is for stripped down procurement. In an age of austerity, it's about reducing costs. That's the government leadership in the area, and this was what was receiving criticism. The TUC comes at it clearly from a very different angle. And they're talking about strategic procurement. And in a very compelling submission, that this was one of the quotes that I picked up from the TUC. So this is the social agenda. But both perhaps have a role, but both can be important, and neither necessarily has to be applied in a uniform fashion. But government is where everyone looks for leadership and coordination. And we heard from Sue about the sort of steps that the Welsh Government is taking in relation to coordination and leadership. And that is what certainly this committee was seeking from the UK government. Interestingly, the UK government since that has taken steps, for example, in relation to the Crossrail contract. Originally, the Thameslink rolling stock contract didn't go to Bombardier, which, okay, is a Canadian company but had a UK factory. The Crossrail contract did go to Bombardier, and my understanding is that there were various social measures or conditions or criteria that were built into that process. So the government is, to be fair, being responsive. Now, New Dawn. This is actually a photograph from a friend's place in North Devon. I'm envious as well. And the geographically astute among you will realise it therefore can't be dawn. It's actually sunset. But I mean, I guess the question, the question really is the new directive, is this a new dawn for the social agenda? Is it a sunset for stripped down procurement? Pre-tender engagement. Well, one of the things that I found so interesting about Sue's presentation was the do we slide. What do we do? And perhaps Sue was talking around sort of Welsh Government procurement policy more than individual tenders, but it's equally important in relation to individual tenders, particularly important ones. Very often, and this was something that came out in the evidence to the Select Committee, very often what public bodies do is they rush towards the OJEU notice and their procurement consultant works out a procurement plan, and day one is the OJEU notice, and then sort of week one is putting together the PQQ criteria, week two the ITT criteria, etc. And this is, of course, the wrong way around. All of this needs to be done at the very beginning, at the very outset, before you go out to tender. And this is really the opportunity to also engage on social issues, to engage with the community, to talk to local business, to invite them around for bidders' days, to help them understand what the requirement is, to help them inform the requirement, and to think about the market and the costs and the risks and the requirements. So this is the sort of process where strategic procurement can be achieved, and it's all before the actual formalities of the tender begins. Very often in the past, public authorities haven't done this, partly because of political pressure and partly because they were afraid of doing it because they thought that might be biased towards certain potential bidders. And now there's some clarity on this from the directive, which is along the lines of, yes, this is a good idea, and insofar as, for example, a specific contractor has provided some advice before you put the specification together, just make sure that any information you gave to that contractor is then shared with the rest of the bidder community. Similarly with lots, this again is at the planning stage of the procurement. And it has been an issue in relation to certain tenders where the authority is thinking about things like establishing a sustainable market and looking forward to the end of the procurement and what the supply base will be at that stage. But looking perhaps to break a contract up in order to favour SMEs, looking perhaps to ban multi-lot discounts to prevent one company coming in and winning all the lots. And the law has been rather unclear as to whether you can do this. So this, again, is a very welcome clarification from the directive. It's effectively, while it's permissive, it is a requirement to think about it, because if you don't do it, then you've got to provide an explanation. Eligibility we talked about. But just to say there, as far as the social agenda covers issues like, and I know Sue was going to talk about blacklisting, but issues like sort of when and where you can exclude bidders who've engaged in malpractice, as well as bankrupt bidders and corrupt bidders, then there's a lot more flexibility now in the directive at PQQ stage to really reward good corporate practice and ensure for a proportionate period that the bad corporate practice is effectively punished through exclusions from tenders. But bidders need to be able to self-cleanse, and that may involve paying off the government. So you see that recently with Serco paying £68.5 million to the UK government because of the fact that they've been paid to tag prisoners who were no longer alive for a period, and as a result, therefore, of that discussion with government, they paid out a lot of money. Now, it may be that is a step towards their own self-cleansing in relation to their ability to bid for public tenders. And there are time periods, time limitations on the extent to which bidders can be excluded, and effectively, authorities need to be subject to the principle of proportionality. Selection criteria. The only thing I'd add on selection criteria, well, one thing is that there's certain tinkering around things like financial thresholds. There's an acknowledgement that if you put financial thresholds too high, then that's going to exclude smaller companies. And authorities need to think about that and need to think about just how much risk there is and what sort of cover they need in terms of risk. But it seems to me the European Single Procurement Document is a step in the right direction, because that, I've got 5 minutes left, thank you, because that involves bidders having responsibility for example, having certificates of satisfactory completion, information on their supply chain management, their manpower, the proportion of their contract to be subcontracted. All of these issues, which are set out in an annex to the directive, can be put into their single procurement document, and that can be used. That can be used as a tool during the selection phase. The thought that I had was, and I'm just going to get some water as I make this point, was in relation to shortlisting at PQQ stage. What the case law says is that the PQQ selection criteria are exhaustive and you can't go beyond that. But actually what the directive and the current regulations say on shortlisting in relation to a restricted procedure or competitive dialogue procedure, for example, is that once all your bidders pre-qualify in accordance with the pre-qualification criteria, then your shortlisting mechanism needs to be transparent and non-discriminatory. But it doesn't say anything about what that has to be. So potentially you could have a set of reasonably low threshold, financial thresholds and professional suitability thresholds. Seems to me there's no reason why you couldn't then, with those bidders who qualify for the contract, use a shortlisting mechanism which built in social considerations. Now they couldn't be discriminatory against non-UK companies, but it seems to me that is a way at PQQ stage of doing this, as well as sort of admission based on social conditions, which is more about contract conditions. The only thing I'd say about award criteria is the definition of now linked to the subject matter of the public contract is very broad, and it even talks about factors involved in production. Sounds like something out of clause 4 of the Labour Party. It's factors of production. It's broad. I mean, it's every stage of the life cycle. Seems to me that there's a lot of scope there now. Abnormally low tenders, just very briefly. Again, this is about predatory below-cost bids that only big operators are able to put on the table and unfairly exclude small operators. The elephant has not been defined in the directive, so we don't really know what they are. But any sort of predatory bid, game-playing bid, which seeks to distort the process and could only be achieved by a very large organisation that may well fall foul of these provisions, and there's now a positive statutory duty to investigate this issue. So again, it's placing an obligation on authorities to look at this. Point you to Amy against Scottish ministers is a good case to look at the sort of thing that could be an abnormally low tender. And then very briefly, subcontractors, there's some focus on, for example, ensuring that payment is made direct to subcontractors is permissive, but it effectively requires authorities to think about this. And then lastly, conclusions. Well, yes, there is now greater scope under the new directive for pursuing the social agenda. Some of it is permissive, but nevertheless brings focus and focuses the mind of authorities, and some of it is mandatory in relation to duties to investigate, for example, and financial thresholds. Does it mean that there is a new dawn? Well, I think it's certainly progress in that direction, in the right direction. So yes. Does it mean that you can keep more jobs for British workers? Well, no, it doesn't, because that's sort of anathema to the EU free movement principle. But clearly, all of these other things that it does mean, all of the focus pre-tender, all of the consideration of sustainable markets, of lots, of thinking about social considerations, thinking about job creation, thinking about more jobs and better jobs. all of that together is likely effectively to benefit the local economy.
Thank you, Simon, for that.